Welcome to the Microsoft Technical Update for April 2022. This is my view pretty much of what's changed in the Azure security, Defender, information protection environment since January. We try to do these quarterly. With all of the rebranding, obviously this one has been slightly delayed. My name's David Guest. I'm a solution architect and technology evangelist within Cocho, and it's my pleasure today to take you through the various elements that we've identified. We've got a bit of an agenda, so we're going to be looking at Azure Active Directory because that is the main point of what's actually going on. We're going to be talking about Endpoint Manager, to some extent that relates to Intune. We're also going to be talking about Defender. Now, Defender covers a lot of things these days, but specifically we're going to be looking at Endpoint, although we will be talking about a few other things as well. We're going to look at Microsoft Information Protection and some of the naming changes that have happened recently and some of the other announcements. And there's also been a couple of interesting developments that are outside of what we normally talk about, but I think are worth bringing up. So with that, I'm going to move on to Azure Active Directory. Now, we know that Azure Active Directory is really the identity provider of choice when we're coming to the cloud. It supports provisioning, single sign-on, access controls, role-based management, privileged identity management, and lots of other elements as well. Now, one of the things that's not necessarily new, but is definitely worth bringing out because of some of the changes that are happening at the moment, is identity governance. Being able to govern and control the variety of users that are in your environment, whether they are internal or external, is something that's key. If we can't control the users, we have no control. We know that the identity is our security plane, it's our control plane. It's very difficult these days to control all of the devices, even if we know what those devices are. The only thing that we have completely under our control are those user objects. Now, identity governance allows us to do that management, and it allows us to control both internal and external users. By using that governance, we can make sure that the users have access to the right systems at the right times and probably from those right locations and right devices. We can show why people have got the access that they have, not necessarily just through their birthright, but because they have requested and been granted additional access. And that could be access to groups, to teams, or to enterprise applications that have been configured within Azure. This also then allows you to do a full audit trail. When did this user request access? Who signed it off? When was it reviewed? Is it reviewed quarterly? Was that reviewer in a good position to make that determination? What reason did they give for approving or denying it? And a lot of this is done through the implementation of an access package. And access packages can be internal or external. If they're external, they can be linked specifically to an individual organization. So you, as our clients, could actually configure Cocho as an external organization and create an access package that we would use to gain access to a team site on your systems. That request that we make has to be approved by somebody internally, potentially also approved by somebody within Cocho before the user is granted access. Once the access is there, it can be reviewed weekly, monthly, quarterly, 6-monthly, or annually. And once the access is revoked for whatever reason, that user can then be cleanly deleted from the directory, making sure that we don't have users hanging around with nobody able to understand why they were created and how they were created. Those reviews for access packages can also be done against groups. So you can take an internal group of people who may have access to a privilege or to a system and review it separately from an access package. These governance requires an Azure AD P2 license for the users who are making the requests and for the users who are managing them. For external users, it only requires a P2 license for those users who are creating the requests internally, so that's your IT team, and those people are doing the approvals or denials. External users get covered by the 50,000 free licenses for active users each month. Now, why is governance so important? Because one of the things that we get with governance is the ability to control users. And controlling users is something that we've all been wanting to do in a more granular level for years. In Active Directory terms, we had the ability to create an OU, put users in the OU, and then grant somebody access to that OU. In Azure Active Directory, that's been available using administrative units for a while. But those admin units were very difficult to maintain. They were very manually set up. We can now break down Azure AD into discrete units based on a dynamic query. We've had dynamic groups for a while. So we've been able to say, we'll have a finance group, which will have everybody in it where department contains the word finance. What we can now do is create an admin unit that is based on that same query. So we can create a finance administrative unit. We can do the same for HR. We can do the same for marketing. We can do the same for sales, which means we can then create a user account with a role that allows us to administer that specific set of users. So when we assign an administrative role to the unit, we do it from the list of roles that are available for the units themselves. And you can see the list on the screen now. It covers most of the things that you'd want to give privilege to somebody else. Authentication, device, groups, teams, user admin. And by allowing different people to do this IT privilege function, it really means we can be a little bit more controlled about who's doing what to who. When we then define these roles, we can also define who is in the role or who is eligible for it. So we can see here, I've actually started to add a specific user to the password administrative role for the finance scope. So that's the only thing that they will have available to them. When we go through the selection of the members, we can select users or we can select groups. If we use groups, then we can use PIM to allow a user to elevate into that role. And this assignment then becomes very, very much a matter of, well, I need to do password admin on a user. They're in my unit that I can manage. I will elevate my privilege, which is audited, to then reset their password, which is audited, to then revoke and release that privilege so that it's nice and clean. The users are not going to be bothered by it. So that use of the administrative unit should allow us to spread the load, take away some of that IT pressure from the IT department and potentially allow it to go back into its own department, or maybe to assign it to second level help desk or even first level help desk at times. Going back to access reviews, one of the things that we need to do is make sure that the right people are in these groups. Now, that might not always be the same person. One of the things that has now been brought out is the ability to do multi-stage access reviews. Now, it's in preview at the moment, which means it's not supported through GA. To be honest, that probably means it gets better support. But the ability to create an access review that first of all goes to the owner of a group or the team site or the application, and then After they've done their work, it moves on to the user's manager to approve, before potentially moving on to the owner of the application to approve in terms of licensing costs. These multi-stage reviews start to make things flow much more in a business manner. Now on the screen, you can see that we can also select a fallback reviewer. Now the fallback reviewer in this case is somebody who the review will go to should the original reviewer no longer exist. Now reviewers can be the group owner, it can be the user's manager, or it can be the user. Now obviously the user will always exist, but the group owner may have been somebody who's left the business and the group is now orphaned. Should that happen, we need to switch back to a fallback reviewer. So these fallback reviewers are used if the main reviewer does not exist, and could easily be somebody in IT who always will have the ability to do the reviews. We may want to set it up separately for the secondary reviewer. We may want to set it up separately for the tertiary reviewer, or however many steps we want to go through. But adding these additional reviewers in just means that it's more and more likely that the review will take place in the right way. Now, this use of groups and access reviews links to privilege. We're making sure that the users have the right privilege to do the jobs they need to do in the applications they need to do. Now, that's great inside Azure because we have lots of tools that make this functionality available to us. However, we don't all sit only in Azure. We may have systems in AWS, we may have systems in Google, and we need to be able to understand how privileges work across all of those environments. Last year, Microsoft purchased an organization called CloudKnox, and they do a thing which I'm going to call KEAM, mainly because if I pronounce the C with a softness, it becomes seam, and that leads to a different conversation altogether. But KEAM in this place is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. It's making sure that we are applying the correct privileges and entitlements to our users, regardless of whether they're in Amazon, Google, or Azure. And we need to be able to identify what privileges people have. So CloudKnox allows us to link to these disparate systems and actually see what permissions people have and whether or not they are being changed. The concept of permission creep is something we've been familiar with for years. I've been in the organization for a while and I've had access to different systems. And each time a new system is added, I get additional privileges. Nobody generally reviews what privileges I've had before and takes them away. Well, we are now. The identity governance in Azure allows us to do that through access reviews. CloudKnox allows us to do that across the different platforms. And we can identify the privileges that people have, whether that's by roles, whether it's by resource, or whether it's by user. With that, we can then identify any permission creep. And you can see from the screen here that we have a couple of users who have gone through that permission creep. They have been given or allowed to have additional permissions that they don't actually need anymore. This permission creep is something that we need to be aware of so that we can revoke those permissions either automatically or through a process. Either way, being able to view these permissions and this creeping privilege allows us to take control of it before we get any further. Of course, access to the systems is also controlled and something we need to be aware of. And we've been talking about authentication for about as long as I've been in IT. Now, we've started to move to a passwordless environment. The use of the Authenticator app to allow people to sign into the websites using a couple of digits or a one-time password is something we've known about for a while. FIDO keys allows us to do a very similar thing using a hardware token. One of the things that is now available in Azure AD is the ability to use certificates to also do that authentication. Certificates can be linked to a smart card or a virtual smart card, or to a user account where the user holds the certificate with them. But this support for the certificate authentication should mean we get a great deal more from our high security environment. We understand better how a user is authenticating and what they're doing. The ability to use certificates which are phish resistant allows us to be more secure about those users, be more secure about knowing who they are. In the past with Active Directory, we've been able to use the certificates directly against the ADFS infrastructure. But that means we had to maintain ADFS for use with Azure. This new capability allows us to get rid of that ADFS infrastructure and allows us, in effect, to make sure that the users are being controlled and verified purely in a cloud environment. That then gives us a simplified management experience so that we can actually see what's going on. We can make sure that the certificates are loaded in the right place and be very granular about how we're going to have him. Now, all of this should be a good step forward and provide us with some degree of that single sign-on. However, we need to know that the user actually has certificates in place before we can allow them to sign on. And to do that, it means we must get the user to enter their UPN. When we're doing an authentication, we're used to people signing in, going to the Azure website and using either the device or a domain hint to allow them to sign on. Because we're using certificates, Azure needs not only to know which domain you're signing into, but whether or not your user has that certificate. If the user has the certificate, then we can identify that and we give them very, very quickly the ability to sign in with a certificate. For those of us who've had FIDO keys in the past and we understand exactly what's going on with them, we've had that ability to sign in quite easily. This is just providing an extra link on there to allow a user to say, I want to use my certificate. And while we're on the subject of security, one of the things that we've also been using for years is business to business. I am a member of so many external tenants so that I can move quickly and easily between them. In Teams, I can switch my Teams environment to Microsoft and I've become part of the Microsoft ecosystem. The problem with that is that we need to make sure that the user, as they're approaching our environment, is signing in the right way. We can trust the external tenant today to provide an identity and validate a password, but we've always wanted to do the multi-factor authentication ourselves. With devices and device compliance, the fact that we have a third party managing the device means we've been unable to validate its compliance ourselves. And of course, a device that's joined to somebody else's Azure Active Directory isn't available for us to validate. Now, those have all been problems and have meant that users have had to re-register for MFA in our tenant, in our environment. These functionalities are now becoming part of our Azure Active Directory. They're going to give us the ability to allow a user's external organization to provide that multi-factor authentication or device compliancy or Azure hybrid join information as part of the token that comes across. And it's configured in the inbound access settings for your Azure environment. So what we have here is the ability in conditional access to say require MFA, but the user's home tenant can now use their own MFA simply by putting a tick in the Trust Multi-Factor Authentication from Azure AD Tenants box. And we can do the same for compliancy and the same for that Azure AD join. It's great, it works really well, but we have to be aware of what the other side means. So let's take compliance. Inside the COCHO environment, a compliance device is one that has valid antivirus, anti-malware, is encrypted, and has a 6-digit PIN minimum or biometric to sign into the device. It must also be up to date, so the last 2 versions of the operating system. And that's great for an organization that trusts our devices to be compliant. If, on the other hand, our compliance says, well, it must have an antivirus, but doesn't have the encryption, doesn't have the PIN, should we as an organization trust that that is actually compliant? So I think over the fullness of time, you will be looking at your partner's compliance settings to make sure that when they say a device is compliant, they actually mean it. And of course, compliance is actually managed by Endpoint Manager. Used to be Intune, we're slowly getting used to the name change and starting to talk about Endpoint Manager instead. And one of the things that we've needed to do with these endpoint devices is actually manage correctly the local admin access. We don't want users to have local admin access unless they need to do it. Within COCHO, we try to make sure that users don't have that local admin. Most of the time. We do have times where local admin is required. So let's take, for example, my environment. I do quite a bit of work inside PowerShell. I don't pretend to be good at PowerShell or good at scripting, but I do need to run it to do some work on client sites. Updating PowerShell modules requires local admin access if it's going to be shared across more than one user, which is possible. So in order for me to do that PowerShell, I need to have local admin. But that local admin needs to be granted in a easy to use and easy to understand way. But what we really need to do is manage the group membership on the local device. So each local device has a number of groups available to it because it's Windows, and that's the way that Windows works. And here you can see the groups that are available on my device. And the one I really need is administrators. What I want to be able to do is add a user to that administrators group when I require. Now I can do that through a PowerShell script, that's not a problem. Or I can do it by manually running a command within the environment as an admin. Or I can now do it through Intune. And Intune, of course, gives us that ability to actually add in users. I suddenly realized I'm hitting the wrong button on the clicker. So by adding in a user, we can go in and automatically have these users part of the administrators group. And here you can see I've gone into endpoint security. I've gone into the account protection piece, and I've chosen to create a new policy. The policy is a Windows 10 policy, and it's for local user group membership. Because it's the local user group, it's actually affecting the groups on the device, not the groups in any AD. Within that, I then say, I'd like to take this specific user or specific group, and I'd like to add them to the administrators group on the device. I could also remove them. If I use a group for this, then that group could easily be a PIM-enabled group, allowing a user to request access to the group. That access to the group then adds them to the local users on the device, allowing that user to then sign in and become a local admin. That then simplifies how the user gets to be a local admin and is also time limited, because PIM is always time limited, giving them an hour, 2 hours to do the jobs they have to do. But we don't all run Windows. Quite often we have Macs in place, usually within the marketing department, but we do see them in other places. And Macs generally have been a bit of a difficult thing to manage. Yes, Jamf is available, but it's at an additional cost. But there are certain things that you can now do on a Mac without needing to move to Jamf. We can add domain information. We can now configure a web proxy globally across a Mac estate. We can set up printing so that it becomes much more functional for the users, and we can add a password to any of the options for removing a profile. It's not the complete thing yet. It's not as all commanding as Jamf, but obviously it shows that Endpoint Manager is not forgetting about Macs. And we'll be coming back to the subject of Macs a bit later on when we talk about Defender. But when we're building Windows machines, one of the things that we tend to try to do is to use autopilot. An autopilot allows us to rebuild a machine without visiting it. We tell it to reconfigure itself based on a set of criteria, making sure that the user information is valid, then driving down device information and applications to the device. Quite often, we use a status screen to show the status of that rebuild. And more often than not, it works brilliantly, but occasionally something will block it. Now, I have a VM I run here when I'm testing these things out, and I find that if I try to install Office 365, it runs out of time, and it's more down to bandwidth and my VM than it is down to anything else. But sometimes we'll find an application is actually blocking it completely, and it could be that that application is just not available online at the moment. Finding that out has been a problem before now. There is now the ability within the autopilot config and within the enrollment pages to search for an application that you're delivering. And it can show the version number of that app and also whether or not that app is online. That ability to see which apps are running and which are not available actually makes troubleshooting the autopilot process much easier. The other thing that we need to do with autopilot and with all of these endpoint management pieces is understand the compliance. We know a device can fall in and out of compliance over a day. Sometimes that's because maybe BitLocker hasn't run. Sometimes it's because the device hasn't been seen for 30 days. But it's very difficult to find out what's going on and why. We now have new reporting capabilities inside the compliance status, so we can see the specific device and user status, not only whether it's compliant or not, but what specific device is targeted by a policy that is or isn't compliant. It also allows me to see on a setting by setting basis what the problem is. I was working with a client last week, so third week in April, trying to get some new configuration rolled out, trying to do a new autopilot build. And one of the things that I did was I was setting up the rules around a pin for Windows Hello for Business. When I set this up, I used a pin of between 6 to 8 characters. I applied the policy, I then set up my device, I checked it, and my device came back as non-compliant. When I then went into the reporting, I could see that the pin setting status had a conflict. Now that told me that there was some other policy that was also setting pin. It took me a minute or two to find it, but then I could see that the standard policy had a pin of between 6 and 10 characters. My new policy of 6 to 8 was obviously in conflict. So it was very easy to determine and fix. A few minutes of work rather than a few hours of work. And this reporting actually does make things much, much easier to troubleshoot. But when we're using a device, we'll try to do it in multiple ways. Quite often we are in a thick application, Outlook, Word, Teams, but quite often we also work in a browser base. Using Microsoft Edge, which is now Chromium based and really good, is great. But some organizations have still not accepted that Edge works as a good browser and are still using Chrome or Firefox. Chrome management has been the bane of an awful lot of organizations' lives. Setting up the settings for Chrome, how you want Chrome to behave on a device, has been a challenge. And doing it has always required people to use OMA URI. Defining an OMA URI setting has not been fun. It's now been added to the configuration profile inside Windows 10. So within Windows 10, we can go into the administrative templates and we can now have available to us all of the options that we would generally use to configure Chrome. Everything from allowing a screen capture to the extensions that we want, to the search provider, through password managers and printing. In fact, many of the things that are set by default. The fact that these can now be done directly against Chrome rather than through OMA URI just makes things easier to manage and is something that internally we're looking at changing too. But the endpoint itself is something that we need to consider. We need to make sure that it's set up in the right way and being managed in the right way. Now, we're going to be talking about Defender, but just before, Defender has the ability to update SIEM. So what happens in Defender gets past the security graph, gets past to logs, and then gets passed to SIEM systems. The API that has been in use for years that allows this is something that is going to be deprecated. It was originally scheduled to happen on the 1st of April this year, and that got postponed. It's now due to happen in Q3, so sometime between July and September, probably. There is still a chance that it will get postponed again, but in the meantime, if you have the opportunity to do it, you should switch your API links, things you're looking out for, to the Microsoft Defender Incidents API and the Defender for Endpoints Alerts API. It's a relatively easy change to make, but does make things much easier for you going forward. And while we've been using Defender for Endpoint with an E5 license for a few years, it's not been possible with E3s or A3s. Endpoint now has two flavors, P1 and P2. The P1 flavor is available now with the E3 license or an A3 license if you're in academia. It has a hugely strong set of capabilities. It is the same anti-malware and antivirus that is in Defender P2. It's looking to reduce that attack surface to make sure that any attacks that come in are mitigated against as much as possible. It allows device-based conditional access with an additional layer of data protection and breach prevention. So what's the big difference? Well, there's a few things that aren't available in P1, and these are around detection and response and the automatic investigation and remediation. The system's still going to tell you when it's found an issue. It will advertise that fact, but that automatic intelligence, that automatic machine learning is not going to be part of it. If that's something you need for the users, then a P2 license is still required. We're finding a lot of organizations are now switching to P1 rather than some third-party antivirus because it's built in, because it's part of Windows. It should create less time sensitivity and performance issues on the device. And implementing it is simply a matter of adding the license to the user and then removing the legacy third-party antivirus. It should take over immediately and just run. Now, when it's in place and running, we can now actually see better what's happening on the device. So there's some new reporting capabilities available inside Defender. We can have a look at the device control. So on the screen now, we can see any block read write activity that's happening to a device. And this report, and in fact, this image, shows that something unusual happened on a specific date. Now that's something that we could investigate, something that we need to be aware of to make sure that the user isn't being attacked, isn't either taking information out that we need to control or uploading information to somewhere else. We can also monitor the firewall. Now in this case, we can see that a single connection has been blocked on multiple days. Now that's not particularly worrying. But if we were to see that the number of blocked connections is 50 or 60, then we can make an assumption that that device is under attack. That report allows us to then maybe investigate that section of the network, or maybe it's that type of device that is making itself available to attackers in a way that we wouldn't have expected. And attackers, what they're really after is information, whether that's to encrypt as ransomware, or whether it's to exfiltrate data to be used against you, or to launch on WikiLeaks, or however they do it. It is the data that they're after. And Microsoft Information Protection, with all of its controls, allows us to monitor and manage that data. So, information governance is part of this environment. And yes, Microsoft have done it again. They decided to rebrand. So instead of Microsoft Information Governance, we now have Microsoft Purview, Data Lifecycle Management. Purview is a new product that's being added in effect as an umbrella across all of the information protection stack. It does do a lot more though. It's a unified data governance solution that works not just on premises, not just across the cloud, but also through software as a service. So there's quite a lot going on there that people can look at and use. Because we're doing this management and because we're viewing data in multiple locations, we can create an up-to-date map of where data is and what data is being held. We can do an automatic data discovery. Can you tell me all of the locations that Project 27 is mentioned in? If Project 27 is seen as being sensitive, we can classify that data and then take action against that depending on what that data classification is. That sensitivity is something we've been talking about for a while in Azure Information Protection and Microsoft Information Protection, but it's now moving to cover databases and other systems as well. The data map shows us where data is. So is it in a data center? Is it sitting in Azure? Is it sitting in Amazon? And if it is, which location is it actually in for all of those? We can then look at the details as to which data is held in which place. Once we've identified the sensitive data, then we can start to map out what's happening with it. Where is it being moved to? How is it being used? Is it being analyzed directly, or is it just being consumed? What type of classification is being assigned? Is it by email address? Is it by specific data that we're looking for, invoices, sensitive data sets, or credit card numbers? By understanding this information, we can then decide what we want to do about it. And when we look at data classification, we can create our own internal specific data classifications. Again, sensitive information types is something we've been using in AIP for years, but here we're spreading it wider. We're putting it across not just Office files, but also databases, SAP systems, and other locations. And we can create these sensitive information types using either a regex. So if we can define what we're looking for as a regular expression, then that's great. Or we can say, I need to look for these specific words. The words are added to a text file, so it becomes a dictionary, and we just upload the dictionary whenever we want to change it. We then set a threshold for how important the match is. If it's a regular expression, well, that data match threshold could be 100%. Anytime you see it and it matches, that's a hit. But with words or with other elements, it's actually a bit less likely. So we can set the threshold at Microsoft recommended 60% or lower or higher. And we can tweak this as we go. So what data sources are we looking at? Well, it's quite a big list. It covers everything from MySQL, on-premises SQL, through to Amazon S3, through to Cassandra, and of course, all of the Azure databases as well. Once we've connected to the data source, we can then identify and classify them. So when we're doing that, we're looking at files, we're looking at tables, and we're looking at columns. Files and columns can be automatically labeled. A table, unfortunately, still requires a little bit of manual intervention to actually assign the relevant label, the classification, the sensitivity to it. And then we can scan and scan again and scan again. If we see something has changed, maybe some data has been added to a column that now means that that column should be higher classified, well, the rescan will add the classification, not replace. So we now have the capability of multiple classifications on a column of data within a database, which we then need to manage. Sensitivity labeling applied to files is still available and is something we can use on an ongoing basis. And in fact, we've been doing it for a long time. The sensitivity of this presentation, for example, is public because it's a public presentation. With information protection, we could also protect a document based on its specific sensitivity. Board papers may not be leaked and available to anybody outside of the board. And if they do try to open it, well, it should be protected. It should be encrypted. And that encryption has been around for a while, but it did used to stop us sharing documents. If a document was in SharePoint and it was encrypted, only one person could edit it at a time. That's now changed, and we can edit it using Word, or we can edit using the browser version anytime. As of today, the co-authoring on a mobile device, so Android tablets, iOS and iPadOS, is now available. So we can edit that quite easily. Because we have sensitivity labeling, we can also define our data loss prevention policies based around those specific things. And that data loss prevention is now available for Mac OS as well. Uses Defender for Endpoint and allows us to specifically say, look at this Mac, but there are some specific locations on a Mac I don't want you to monitor. That could be the personal area. It could be specific things that you know what to deal with. But now we have the ability on a Mac to stop people uploading files through Safari to Box or Dropbox or other locations. And coming to the end, the last thing I want to really talk about is a thing called auto patch. Patching, something we've all worried about for years, something we need to be aware of. We can now configure auto patch against Windows 10 and 11. It does require you to have Azure AD somewhere. It requires some kind of management, whether it's Intune or System Center Config Manager for code management. But it allows us to update on a regular basis using the method that we want and the release version that we want, the quality and feature updates for Windows, the drivers associated with them, any firmware updates, and of course the Microsoft 365 apps. So that's pretty much the last slide I wanted to cover as a tech update. We've covered information protection, and there will be a future webinar that's going to deal with compliance and more about Purview in a lot more detail, hopefully sometime in the next few months. If there's anything here that you actually wanted to go into any more detail, give us a call, contact your co-chair representative, and we'll happily arrange a vision call to go through any of these in more detail. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for paying attention for the last 45 minutes. I'm sorry about the slight technical hiccup in the middle where I was having a coughing fit, but I look forward to seeing you on the next event. Thank you.